Welcome to my studio. I've been doing some reflecting on questions that Jesus asked. And these come really from just reading through the Gospels and taking note of when Jesus asked questions. And I'm thinking, well, that was quite the question that he asked, you know. And the one I'm looking at today comes from Mark chapter 7, verse 18. And the question in the NIV, the way it says is, are you so dull? Well, it doesn't seem like a real kind question to ask. We might say, "Are you still so dense?" And anyway, I've kind of wanted to rephrase this a little bit to say, "Are you a slow learner? Have you not learned yet?" Because actually, probably a more literal translation of this might be, "Are you so lacking in understanding? Don't you understand yet?" Kind of an approach. The New English translation says, "Are you so foolish?" And the Greek word here actually means unintelligent or without understanding, or even in a more harsh way, stupid. And so I might want to paraphrase this a little different to say, Jesus looking to his disciples and said, "Don't you get it yet?" And that's an okay way to think of that. And because Jesus is wanting to teach a deeper principle that they might understand. And so let's look at that a little bit. The context here is that it's a long passage. It goes back to Mark 7 and starting at verse 1, and it goes on for 23 verses. So I'm not going to read all these verses, but just to kind of summarize what he's saying. Some Jewish Pharisees and teachers of the law had come up from Judea, apparently to Galilee, and they're kind of gathered around Jesus. Now, what we don't see from the context of reading this is that they came with hostility in mind. Sometimes they seem to have it. When Jesus is at the home of a Pharisee, sometimes they're watching him to see what he might do or say. That doesn't necessarily seem to be the case here, but they're gathered around Jesus, but they made an observation that the disciples of Jesus were eating without first ceremonially or washing their hands. They were eating with, quote, defiled hands. That troubled them. And so they asked Jesus about that. Why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands? And so Mark seems to give an explanatory parenthesis on this. Well, the Pharisees, they wash their hands all the time. Every time they go to the market, and they're washing the cups and everything because they want to be so careful. And the reason is because that was the tradition or teaching of the elders. It was of the Jewish leadership that had gone before that had made this so clear. And that was a part of what Pharisaic tradition was about. They had a lot of laws and regulations that they had put in place because they did want to be devout people. And so the washing of cups and kettles and of their hands was one of those. They had a whole list of them in terms of the Sabbath, for example. And that was where they really found fault with Jesus often. And so here they simply observed the disciples, they don't have their hands washed. And so Jesus explains that when the Pharisees asked him, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders, instead eating their food with defiled hands?" And so then Jesus responds by quoting from Isaiah 29 and verse 13 when he says, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." Pretty strong statement. But that's basically the summary of what Jesus is observing. The Pharisees have a lot of human rules and traditions, but where's their heart at? Now, he uses a word that we've taken to mean be pretty harsh, that word hypocrite. And I don't really like when anyone calls me a hypocrite. But what Jesus is saying, what we're doing here by just following human tradition without really having a pure heart is just play acting. We're just being actors. And it's not really who we are on the inside. And so Jesus is trying to use this to point out to them there's some things that are much more significant than just doing the surface kinds of stuff. And then he illustrates it for them by giving an example of something that was fairly common, where he said, you have a way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your tradition. And he uses the idea of saying that certain money is dedicated to God. It's devoted to God, and therefore I can't use it for anything else. And so we might say in our day that we're going to have some of our resources that we say, well, that's what I'm going to give to the Lord. But then we're going to say, I'm not going to be able to use it for anything. Well, maybe we could give it to the Lord and use it for things he's asked us to do just as well. And so he says, you devote this money, but then you don't care for your parents. And the Bible is so clear that you need to honor your father and your mother and care for them. And you can see we're in that culture when people are elderly in those days before Social Security or whatever. They depended on their children who still had the capability of helping them out. And so Jesus is kind of going right to the heart of the matter. We can't so much live by the letter of the law of the traditions, but we need to look at our heart and where's that out. And so then he explains it further when he says, listen to me, everyone, and understand nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them. And some manuscripts even add that little expression that we see other places in the Gospels. If you have ears to hear, listen. In other words, what would you learn about this? Well, here's the interesting, where this question comes from today, where Jesus asks his disciples, are you so dull? Because then when they are alone by themselves, the disciples asked him, well, what did you mean by that? That nothing that comes into a person can defile them, and it's what comes out of a person that really is what defiles them. And so then Jesus says, don't you see that nothing that enters a person from outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, it goes into their stomach, and then it's eliminated from the body eventually through the process of digestion and all that. That's not what we're being defiled is. It's what comes from the heart. And he says, for it's from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit. And he goes on to say, envy, slander, arrogance. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. So I'm pondering this. Am I a slow learner? Do I understand that it's really the character that matters? Who I am as a person on the inside. And so my thought is, to what extent can Christians today be kind of like the Pharisees, following the traditions of all the things that we know to be the things to do or not to do, for example? And yet maybe our heart is not really in quite the right place. And so, for example, a person may say, well, I'm going to church all the time. Or maybe even I'm reading the Bible. Or I am avoiding those vices that we know you should avoid, like drunkenness or whatever it might be. And there can be a number of things that we're just kind of trying to follow, and yet where's our heart? I have to ask myself, am I guilty of envy? Am I guilty of being judgmental? What about harboring bitterness or holding a grudge or gossiping? And we all need to ask ourselves those questions. Where's our heart at? Because it's out of our heart that the evil comes from. And Jesus has quite a list of things that come from the heart. And so it seems to me that we need to keep asking ourselves the question, what kind of a person am I becoming? Am I a slow learner, or am I continuing to grow? And then I'm thinking of the prayer that David had in Psalm 139 that's really worthy of praying. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And I pray that God will give us sincere and pure hearts so that we bring him honor in the way we live our lives. Well, if you enjoyed this time, I invite you to subscribe to this series, and you can do that by clicking my photo on the lower left part of or lower right-hand side of the screen. And please feel free to leave a comment, and may God bless you today.